And that concludes the review of the Time Machine. So I hope you all enjoyed it, and we'll see you next week. Bye. Oh, I've just got to reset the buttons on my Time Machine. And welcome to this evening's stream, everybody. Sorry. Had to be done. I mean, come on, it's a Time Machine for goodness sakes. Had to be done. Apologies. And now we've encountered the middle of this conversation. Evening, everyone, and welcome to the craziness that is the writing stream. That's sort of a podcast, I suppose, but it's a stream. It's a peculiar thing, isn't it? This whole streaming malarkey. But there we go. It's a white hole. No one's seen one before. No one has. Somebody punch you out. Some people will be, what are they talking about? Anyway, we must do the thing, because the thing is the thing, and the thing must be done at the right time. Let's do that. Right, who's first in the chat? Commander JR1988 is here. Good to see you, Commander JR1988. Wintermute GB is here. Of course he is. Stalwart of the stream. Dragon Eye is here. Henrik Torvald is here as well. Good to see you, Henrik. Commander Tragic Blue is here. Drew Wager is here. Whoever's he? What's he doing in the chat? The Harkonnens are here! Yay! It's good to see the Harkonnens. Always ready to invade Arrakis as they are. Frank Miner 2949er is here as well. Mad Monksoft is here. Fingers poised on Wikipedia just in case we need him. Glenn is here. Good to see you, Glenn. Alan is here as well. The stalwarts of the writing stream are here in force, which is excellent to see. Commander Sea Dweller is here as well. Big Thed 9GT is here as well. And Duplex, excellent. It's very good. It's really good. So anyway, welcome one and welcome more. Have you done your homework? Well, the homework this week was to start reading the Time Machine. Now, I'm not necessarily expecting you to all finish these things. The idea of these streams is kind of just to get an introduction. For some of you who haven't approached these things, is it worth your time going to have a look at some of these sci-fi classics? And our conclusion with War of the Worlds last week was very much so. It was a very well written story, actually, with a lot of, and considering it's always good to share. If I could turn back time, there's could be a lot of time jokes to see you doing out there. But I see what you did there. And it's not a particularly long book. Now the Time Machine is even shorter, so I think we clocked War of the Worlds at 60,000 words, maybe just a tiny little bit more. And the Time Machine is about half that. It's only like 30,000 words long. I thought it was I was expecting a much longer book. I finished it in just a couple of hours. I mean, I not skimmed, but I read through it really fast. And it was like, is that it? Oh, it's over. Okay, fine. Right, good. It's like, okay. Because I'm quite a fast reader anyway. So it's interesting. So we will dabble in this. Now, it's interesting, a bit of context on this one. Let me, first of all, let's get it up on the screen, of course, because, Mr. Wells, we should do justice to him. Let's get it up on the screen. Where's the right button? That one. There we go. Right. Can you all see that? Yes, you can. And it turns out this is one of H.G. Wells' early novels. So it's. Having read through it, I was thinking this isn't. I mean, it's a good. I mean, preface this with a little bit. It is quite good, right? It's quite a good story, but it isn't. I don't think as good as or as well written as the War of the Worlds. And I was wondering why. Why? It's almost like the. He was better as a writer when he did War of the Worlds than the Time Machine, and I was thinking, oh, that's a bit weird. And then I looked up the dates of his writing, and this book precedes the War of the World by quite a bit. So this is actually one of his really early novels. So we are doing a little bit of time traveling here. So it's been going back a little bit. Is it actually his first novel? Is it really? Oh, okay. In that case, maybe it's his first novel then. It's is it an early novel? Is it one he wrote later and just put back in the past? Who knows? Maybe that's how it works. But this is kind of his maybe it's his sort of debut as a writer, and the story shows that it's not as well constructed and it's not as well written as the War of the Worlds. He clearly learnt a lot of his craft by the time he got to the War of the Worlds, which is quite interesting to see his development as a writer. Which you're looking at this sort of stuff, so that's quite good. So that's the first sort of observation. So I think this is 1895 or 1894, simultaneously his first and his final novel. It's the first novel in the collection I have, says Wintermute. Lucky Luigi, good to see you as well. Hello, welcome to the chat. So the complete works of H.G. Wells is a 252-hour read. Wow. But Frank Miner, you're quite right that most of H.G. Wells' stuff is pretty easy to read. It is surprisingly modern compared to some of the other stuff of around this era. It's actually really, really, really quite readable. You don't have to. You're not like kind of struggling to. I did encounter. I will get to it. I did encounter one word in the first sentence. Thought, I don't know what that means. I'm going to have to look that up. And there's a few other bits and pieces that crop up. And you go, I wonder what that's all about. So we'll discuss those as we get to it. So that's quite good. Glenn says, one thing I found strange in War of the Worlds is he's writing it as if the character in the story wrote it. Yeah, so he's sort of almost role playing it, isn't it, as a journalist. So that's quite good. And so that's quite good. Now this one, the characterization is odd, I think, because what happens is let's get into the book. So that's basically it. So one thing I think is a bit interesting here. Now, I'd like your opinion on this as fellow writers and readers. Is a contents page where each chapter tells the title of is kind of a title in itself, right? Chapter 1, introduction. Chapter 2, the machine. Chapter 2, the time traveler returns. What's interesting. I think chapter 15 there, or XV as it is in Roman numerals there, is the time traveller's return. Okay, so he does come back there at the end of the story. I find these old-fashioned chapter namings a little bit kind of like, hang on, you're giving away some of the plot points already. So it's kind of like, we know he gets back. I don't mind it, but I've got some old books. I don't know if you've come across them. Things like, the obvious one is what's her name? Enid Blyton did this a lot, whereby it'd be like chapter 2, whereupon I don't know what the names were. Pete and Emily discover the bad guy is actually the postman or something like that. And it's like, well, hang on, you just summarised the chapter in the chapter title. I don't need to read that chapter now because I know that Emily and Pete discover the postman is the bad guy. I don't know. It seems like an odd thing to do, but it's quite common in older novels. So I don't know. Was this the thing at the time? Now this was serialised into bits and pieces that were released periodically. So I think this was all serialised. So what you'd get is presumably in a newspaper or a pamphlet or something. Not quite sure how they did it back in the 19th century. You'd get one chapter at a time, maybe one every week. It was like the modern equivalent of a sort of binge, a sort of Netflix binge, wasn't it? Save them up and binge them all at one go. So I wonder if it needed that because it was serialised, and maybe that's where it stemmed from. I don't know. It's quite interesting. Crazy Otto, hello, Drew and chat. Hope things are well in your endeavours. They're all good. My endeavours are all endeavouring, which is good. So did it have the same titles in the series? I don't know, Frank. It's possible. I would have thought probably guessing yes. Can you imagine Conan Doyle introducing a book calling the character the murderer? It would save Holmes a lot of time. Yes, that's right. Chapter 9, where Holmes and Watson discover that Lady Penelope is in fact guilty as charged. So yeah, and the time machine. The time machine is an oddly written one because like you say, Alan, it's a first person account by someone who's listening to someone giving a first person account. So you kind of got like a sort of meta view of the story. So it is a bit weird in the way it's written, and his characterization is very odd and it's very formative. And it's very almost immature. It's H.G. Wells starting out. So it's not nearly as well written as War of the Worlds. So if you're coming from War of the Worlds, which of course we did last week, we should have done this in reverse order, but that's time travel for you, right? If you're watching this on YouTube, go back and watch this one first, even though it's not there yet. But it will be by the time you're watching this, okay? Because that's how YouTube works. Watch this episode before you've watched the previous episode, okay? And it will make a lot more sense. So anyway, let's start off because that's what we do. Introduction, chapter 1. The time traveller. He never gets named. Okay, he never gets named. So it's not Bob or Charles or Robert or anything. He's just the time traveller. So we're getting this in a kind of weird third person. The time traveller, for so it will be convenient to speak of him, was expounding a recondite. I don't know how you pronounce that. Recondite matter to us. So anyway, I stopped on the first sentence and thought, there's a word. It's a word I don't know what it means. So let's go look up recondite or recondite or whatever it is. I'll beat you to it, says Commander Cedarwell. I've already watched this stream tomorrow. Fantastic. So recondite, there we go. I did look this up earlier on. It's an adjective of a subject or knowledge little known or obtruse or abstruse. So obscure. So basically what he's saying there is an obscure matter. Okay, whatever they're talking about is very obscure and difficult. Okay, so that was the start. Okay, it's always good to learn new words, isn't it? His pale grey eyes shone and twinkled, and his usually pale face was flushed and animated. Look at the number of adverbs he's using. I like that. It's obscure enough. Recondite. Oh, the irony. It's going. It's so obscure. We had to look it up. The fire burnt brightly. There's more adverbs in this paragraph that we could shake a stick at. The fire burnt brightly. The soft radiance of the incandescent lights and the lilies of silver caught the bubbles that flashed and passed in our glasses. So it's quite a. Our chairs being his patents, which is interesting. Okay, so the time traveller has a house where he's personally designed the chairs and painted the design. It's like, okay, that's quite intense, isn't it? And the chairs are doing something quite unusual here. The chairs, being his patents, embraced and caressed us rather than submitted to be sat upon. It's quite an unusual type of chair, really. It feels like Drew's over description of the internal combustion engine. It is. It shows, dare I say it, poor H.G. Wells, an immaturity in his writing. Okay, an immaturity in his writing. He's not as good a writer at this stage as he became. It's quite interesting to see. So anyway, kinky chairs. Embracing and caressing us. I quite fancy one of these chairs. I think we should go and get one. And there was that luxurious after dinner atmosphere when thought runs gracefully free of the trammels of precision. I don't know what that means either. Okay, so we're 2 words in. One paragraph in, and there's two words. Okay, so see definitions. I'm assuming it's not a 3-layered dragnet designed that the fish entering through one of the larger meshed outer sections will push part of the finer mesh central section through the large meshes on the further side, forming a pocket which the fish is trapped. That doesn't sound like the right context to me. Restrictions or impediments to freedom of action. Okay, that sounds more like it. So we're gracefully free of impediments of precision. It's like, I'm going to put some pretty darn clever words in this paragraph so you know you're dealing with a proper writer. That's the impression I get. It's badly overwritten, isn't it? Needs an editor. And he put it to us this way, marking the points with a lean forefinger as we sat and lazily admired his earnestness over this new paradox, as we thought it, and his, here's another word, fecundity. the heck does that mean? Okay, so it's one paragraph, 3 words. Fecundity means the ability to produce many new ideas, which is actually quite a nice word. I've heard of the word myself, but I couldn't remember it either. So if I have to look it up, I have to look it up. That's kind of the rule. So yeah, he's definitely trying a bit hard there. It was quite interesting. I know fecundity from bioscience. Yeah, I think it's got a different. Is it a common? Might be in your literary circles when to meet GB. I'm sure he had his thesaurus open next to him while crafting this opening chapter. It does feel a little bit like that, doesn't it? It feels like he's kind of like, yeah, I'm a serious writer. Here I go. It's possible, though. I mean, it's possible. Maybe we're being unfair. It's possible. Maybe he's trying to give an impression of the narrator, but I'm not convinced. that's the giving him a great deal of benefit of the doubt at that point. That's right. I'm anaspeptic, phresmatic, even compunctious to have caused you such pericombobulations. It is a little bit in that. Like, you can see why people like the writers of Blackadder were taking the mickey out of these sort of things. Right. So then this time traveller who remains nameless throughout the entire story. Right. We never find out much about him, other than he's clearly a man of some means because he's got a house, the ability to create a time machine. And the ability to entertain lots of guests, and he is a character who is rather given to little speeches as well. Okay, so you must follow me carefully. I shall have to controvert. What does that mean? Deny the truth of something. Argue about. Right. I'm gonna. You could have. Don't use a perfectly straightforward word. A really complicated one will do, right? But bear with it. It gets better. It does get better. I'm being a bit unfair to poor old Mr. Wells here, but it's nowhere near as accessible early on as War of the Worlds is. War of the Worlds gently leads you into the story. This really doesn't. Okay, we get that first paragraph which sort of sets the scene, and that is literally it. Okay. And then we're straight into some fairly complicated stuff. Okay, okay, you're going to have to concentrate here. Are you ready? Here we go. You must follow me carefully. I shall have to controvert or argue one or two ideas that are almost universally accepted. The geometry, for instance, they taught you at school is founded on a misconception. Okay, so basically the time traveller is basically saying your education is rubbish. Is that not rather a large thing to expect us to begin upon, said Philby, who I think is about the only character who gets a name, poor old Philby. And Philby's only distinguishing feature is that he's an argumentative person with red hair. So I don't know if Sean's here tonight, but he's probably Scottish. That's what's going on in my head at this point. So... and then we get one of these really long. He's getting one of these really long kind of narratory things. I do not mean to ask that you accept anything without reasonable ground for it. You will soon admit as much as I need from you. You know, of course, that a mathematical line, a line of thickness nil, has no real existence. They taught you that. Neither has a mathematical plane. These things are mere abstractions. Okay, so we're actually into Euclidean geometry straight away here, okay, we're now talking about abstract geometrical things. It just instantly, that's the 4th paragraph of the story. That is all right, said the psychologist. So there's a psychologist here who's just the psychologist. Okay, he hasn't got a name either. And another thing here is that it's a little bit tricky. And we've discussed this on our own writing, actually, about who's talking. Okay, so you kind of have to infer from the speech who it is. Nor having only length, breadth, and thickness can a cube have real existence. And that presumably that's the time traveller. Okay, and then so Philby objects. There I object, said Philby. Of course a solid body may exist, all real things. Ah, so most people think. But wait a moment, can an instantaneous cube exist? Don't follow you, said Philby. Can a cube that does not last for any time at all have a real existence? Philby became pensive. Anyway, so this is it's quite a long. This is quite a introduction here. Any real body must have extension in 4 directions. It must have length, breadth, thickness, and duration. And he basically introduces the concept of time as a 4th dimension in this piece of text. Okay, straight away. So he literally within the first few paragraphs, we're having to grapple with the 4th dimension directly. There are really 4 dimensions, 3 which we call 3 planes of space, and a 4th, time. There is, however, a tendency to draw an unreal distinction between the former 3 dimensions and the latter, because it happens that our consciousness moves intermittently in one direction along the latter from the beginning to the end of our lives. It's like, okay. That, said a very young man, who has the distinction of later on only being referred to as the very young man, made spasmodic efforts to relight his cigar over the lamp. This is a bit of, I think this is a little bit of humour, right? He says, now that, he says, that was very clear indeed. I can sort of see him sitting by the mantelpiece with his cigar. Yes, totally got that. I understand everything. Probably drinking some brandy, I'd imagine, as well. Now, the time traveller is unfazed by this and keeps on. Really, what is meant by this 4th dimension, though there are some people who talk about the 4th dimension, they do not mean it. It's another way of looking. This is the thing, a classical thing of this type of era of writing, is that they do a lot of dialogue whereby they start like this. Okay, they go, right, the thing that we're going to discuss is, and when I say discuss, what I mean by discuss is to converse about the topic and go off at a complete tangent discussing aspects of the topic. In fact, possibly even the meaning of the word discuss, but we'll get to that in a moment. Prior to the fact that we eventually, by the time we get to the end of the sentence, wrap around back to the initial topic which I was going to expound upon. And you're going, what? What were you trying to say? I'm confused. And I think that's a 19th century thing. It's very, very common. Okay, so Mad Monksoft has delved into Wikipedia for us. The idea of adding a 4th dimension began with Jean Laurent de Lambert, Dimensions, being published in 1754, and was followed by Joseph Louis Lagrange in the mid-1700s, culminating in a precise formalisation of the concept in 1854 by Bernhard Riemann. There we go. Hopefully they get around to it before the end of the book. Well, this is the funny thing, this book isn't very long. The time traveller definitely had waffler's disease. Yes, he's worse than me, the time traveller, and that's saying something. There is no difference between time and any of the 3 dimensions of space except our consciousness moves along it, but some foolish people have got hold of the wrong side of that idea. Have you not all heard what they say about this 4th dimension? So anyway, he's expounding upon this. I have not, said the provincial mayor, who has the distinction of only being described later on as the provincial mayor. None of these people have names or characters. Okay, they're just people with roles to play. So far we have Philby. Philby is the only one who gets a name, I think. He is an argumentative person with red hair. Okay, so he's probably got the most description of anybody, right? Then there's the psychologist, who is a psychologist, one presumes. And then there is the very young man, who is a very young man who likes cigars. We know that. And there's the provincial mayor, who is presumably a provincial mayor. That's as far as we've got so far. In the late 19th century, the first known waffle recipe. Thanks, Mad Monksoft. Alan, you're quite right. This is the phrase that where the time machine as a concept was invented. So this is a significant book, but as you can see, nowhere near as well written as War of the Worlds. Anyway, so I mean, H.G. Wells had some interesting ideas. I mean, he'd got this really, really cleverly written out. He's thought this through, but it's just not very well described. To be fair to H.G., they don't need names, just vague reference to their possible perspective. I think that's fair, but I think we deserve some names, because he knows these people. He's having dinner with them. he wouldn't just invite a random collection of people to his house. So I think we deserve a little bit more about these people. So I'll try and work my way through this next paragraph. It's simply this: space, as our mathematicians have it, is spoken of as having 3 dimensions, which one may call length, breadth, and thickness, and is always definable by reference to 3 planes, each at right angles to the others. Everybody following so far? Some philosophical people have been asking why 3 dimensions particularly? Why not another direction at right angles to the other 3? And they've even tried to construct a 4-dimensional geometry. Professor Simon Newcomb was expounding this to the New York Mathematical Society only a month or so ago. Good on Professor Newcomb. Now, so a character that we're never going to meet, who's never actually in the book, gets a name and a surname. But none of the others do. You know how on a flat surface which is only 2 dimensions we can represent a figure of 3-dimensional solid, and similarly they think that by models of 3 dimensions they could represent one of 4 if they could master the perspective of the thing. See? Which actually gets you into interesting things like tesseracts, doesn't it? This bit again is a nice bit of humour, I think. Yeah, I think so, murmured the provincial mayor, and knitting his brows he lapsed into an introspective state, his lips moving as one who repeats mystic words. Yes, I think I see it now, he said after some time, brightening in quite transitory manner. I think that is H.G. Wells basically going, the provincial mayor has got no clue what the time traveller is talking about. But goes, yes, completely with you there, old chap. So yeah. Didn't you do this in Elite Premonition though, Drew? The club characters were only named by their roles. Well, I suppose yes, you could do that. But that was because I didn't. They specifically had to be hidden, and they've never been revealed. Ba, ba, ba. So yeah, well, yeah, I'll let him off a bit, maybe. I'm not convinced. Well, I do not mind telling you. Okay, so surprise, surprise, the time traveller has been working on this 4-dimensional thing. Okay, some of my results are curious. For instance, here's a portrait of a man 8 years old. Okay, so this is another bit of bad writing. Okay, she sends his thanks for the pardon. It's quite all right, Mr. Wells. If you have, by the way, Mr. H.G. Wells, if you have invented time travel, feel free to pop into the stream and say hello. We'd love to have a chat. So what's interesting here is, for instance, here is a portrait of a man at 8 years old. Now we have to assume the time traveller has pulled out a portrait of somebody, right? And another at 15, another at 17, another at 23, and so on. Okay, so what has he got, like a photo album or? But there's no description. Okay, the time traveller is just talking. There is no. Of course, what you should do. Some of my results are curious. You know, end speech dialogue mark. He brought out a photo album and turned it towards him. You know, it's not good writing. It's got quite a lot of flaws. It's quite interesting. All of these are evidently sections, as it were, 3-dimensional representations of a 4-dimensional being, which is a fixed and unalterable thing. Okay, so he's kind of drawing quite a cool analogy, though, isn't he? That, you know, if you take a picture of somebody every year and string them along, it's the same person, but clearly in 3 dimensions they're altering shape and size and weight and everything. So there we are. And that's a 4-dimensional representation of a 3-dimensional object. Again, a nice little joke here, I think. Scientific people, prose. Interesting that the word here, proceeded, the time traveller. Yeah, so he's a little bit guilty of using lots of alternative words to the word said, which is, again, something we've talked about in the writing stream in the past. So proceeded the time traveller, but after the pause required for the proper simulation of this, okay, he's basically waiting for his audience to catch up, so it's quite funny. Know very well that time is only a kind of space. Here it's a popular scientific diagram, a weather record. And then he kind of draws the analogy of a barometer rising and falling, which draws a line on something, and that line is a thing, a representation of a 4-dimensional passage of time. And then And we've got another no character. Okay, but, said the medical man, and the medical man's only distinguishing feature is that he likes to stare at the coals in the fire. Okay. So there's a medical man. He asks a good question though. If time is really only a fourth dimension of space, why is it, and why has it been regarded as something different? Why can't we move in time as we move about in the other dimensions of space? Okay, so there's some pretty reasonable context here. Now, bear in mind this is all pre-Einstein, right? This is pre-Einstein. So Einstein's theory of relativity and general relativity have not been worked out yet. This is pre that. We've got Newtonian physics, but we haven't got general relativity. So this is actually quite insightful in some ways. They've obviously had some good thinking about it, and as we know, H.G. Wells was a pretty smart guy. Staring at the coals, dreamy of cauterizing the time traveler's mouth. Ow! Time traveller smiled. Now this is a bit weak. This bit I didn't like this. Are you so sure we can move freely in space? Right and left we can go, backward and forward freely enough. And men have always done so. I admit we move freely in 2 dimensions, but what about up and down? Gravitation limits us there. So, well, not exactly, said the medical man. There are balloons. And I quite agree with the medical man here. I think he's got quite the right objection. But before the balloons, save for spasmodic jumping and the inequalities of the surface, man had no freedom of vertical movement. Still, they can move up and down a little, said the medical man. Easier, far easier down than up. Well, that's probably true. And you cannot move up in time at all. You cannot get away from the present moment. And this is where he drops his bombshell, okay? My dear sir, that is where you are wrong. That's where the whole world has gone wrong. We are always getting away from the present moment. Our mental existences, which are immaterial and have no dimensions, we are passing along the time dimension with a uniform velocity from the cradle to the grave. We should just travel down if we began our existence, just as we should travel down if we began our existence 50 miles above the Earth's surface. But the great difficulty in this, interrupts the psychologist, rather adroitly, you can move about in all directions of space, but you cannot move about in time. Aha! That is the germ of my great discovery. You are wrong to say that we cannot move about in time. For instance, if I am recalling an instant very vividly and go back to an instance of its occurrence, I become absent-minded, as you say. I can jump back for a moment. So he's kind of equating time travel to memory there, which is a bit weird. The worst bit is when H.G. Wells goes back in time, corrects all these mistakes and makes Drew's criticism wrong. That'd be good. That I'm being critiqued by an author 150 years after I died. Yeah, so that is quite interesting. I mean, H.G. Wells was no intellectual slouch, was he? I mean, he's writing here about concepts which, for us nowadays, probably in the circles that you guys and me kind of hang around in, is fairly well trodden stuff, right? But in 1895, this is pretty advanced stuff. Glenn said, if I had a time machine, I would go back in time just before H.G. Wells became popular and write better than him. And we'd all be talking about G.R. Frank and his amazing time travel story. When he says, this guy just seems to know everything about the future. What's going on? He's just amazing visionary sci-fi author, Glenn R. Frank. That would be quite cool. Alan, there's a very good point there. There's nothing in the story about temporal paradoxes. Okay. Interesting enough, the time machines, and we'll get to time machines in a bit, only go forward in time. Except when the time traveller has to go back to the present day, which it does at the end of the story, and we already know that because the chapter titles told us. So that's in itself is quite interesting. You would write in the 21st century style, which wouldn't go down well in 1895. Well, how do you know? How can we test this supposition? And when I say test, what I mean, of course, is I think we should define the word test. In fact, maybe a supposition on the word test we should decide. And maybe you should it's easy to write like a 19th century novelist. You just take ages to get to the point and discuss your own discussion in the midst of the discussion. It's straightforward. Now here's an interesting thing that puts it into context, right? in terms of the time. Okay, so for instance, I am recalling this a bit. We've done the bit. Okay, I become absent-minded. I jump back for a moment. Of course, we have no means of staying back for any length of time, any more than a savage or an animal has of staying 6 feet above the ground. But a civilized man is better off than the savage in this respect. He can go up against gravitation in a balloon, and why should he not hope ultimately he may be able to stop or accelerate his drift along the time dimensions, or even turn about and travel the other way? Bam, bam, bam. Oh, this, began Philby, the only character with actually who's got a name, is all. Why not? Said the time traveller. It's against reason, said Philby. What reason? Said the time traveller. Well, you can show black is white by argument, said Philby. Bit of whataboutism from Philby there. Not a very good objection. But you'll never convince me. Possibly not, said the time traveller. But now you'll begin to see the object of my investigations into the geometry of 4 dimensions. Long ago I had a vague inkling of a machine. Now the very young man jumps in here. To travel through time. Yeah, we should thank the very young man at this stage, because he's basically going, right, let's get this story moving and cut to the chase, shall we? So hats off to the very young man for getting us in the right place. That shall travel indifferently in any direction of space and time as the driver determines. Philby contented himself with laughter. And then here's the drop mic moment. Not that mics had been invented, of course, in 1895, but that's what we're going to do. I have experimental verification, said the time traveller. This upcoming here is a bit of a warning for Glenn if he does go back into the past. That would be remarkably convenient for the historian, the psychologist suggested. One might travel back and verify the accepted account of the Battle of Hastings, for instance. Of all the places you could go back in time to, I know, first thing that occurs, the Battle of Hastings. Let's go there. I know, maybe H.G. Wells, maybe he lived in Sussex. Did he live in Sussex? Let's find out, because that's probably why. Where did H.G. Wells live? Sandgate, was it Sandgate? Was the part? Okay. Of course, we know he lived in Woking, didn't we? So he obviously liked that part of the world. Sandgate is not far from me, actually. Sandgate is just down the road from where I live. He lived in Woking, he did. So Woking and Sandgate is on the coast down by me. In fact, there we go. Look, Sandgate is there, and I live up here in Kingsnorth. So I didn't know that. Sandgate is just down the road from me. So I'm in the company of H.G. Wells in that regard. That's really good. So yeah, he lived in Woking. So obviously Kent and Sussex, the Battle of Hastings was a fairly significant battle in the UK. Not that it was the UK then, but when basically the French came across and beat us and then took over our monarchy and stuff, and we lost. So the Battle of Hastings was William the Conqueror, wasn't it, and Harold. Harold, I think was he an Angle? Before England has existed as a thing, this is. And before France, probably, but it came from France, geographically. This is when all the British people became French, but we don't talk about that. In 1066, it goes a long, long time ago. So, anyway, so the Battle of Hastings, obviously, possibly the first thing that occurred to H.G. Wells is, I know, let's go back there. Don't you think that would attract attention? Said the medical man, quite insightful here. Sorry, I love a tangent. Yes. Our ancestors had no great tolerance for anachronisms. See, Glenn? If we go back in time, we'll just stand up like a sore thumb. People don't like anachronisms back in the past. Now, here's an in-joke, I think, of the time, which I can't quite interpret. So I'm interested to know if you guys know on this one. One might get one's Greek from the very lips of Homer and Plato, the very young man thought. Okay, so that's quite an interesting comment. It's not good writing again, because it says the very young man thought. Okay, so we shouldn't have heard that. In which case they would certainly plough you for the little go. I don't know what that means. Okay, I don't know what that means at all. The German scholars have improved Greek so much. So there's an in-joke there, which is time sensitive, as it were, for 1895. And I don't know what it means. And I don't know who the German scholars were who were mucking about with Greek at the time. But obviously the time traveller has taken a slightly dim view of the German scholars improving, and I think almost in inverted quotes there, improving Greek. And what certainly plough you for the little go means, I have no idea. So if anybody knows what that means, then do explain. It was the Normans and not the French. And Harold, okay, there we go. And Harold too was a Saxon. So Saxons versus the Normans. Okay, yep. So there we go. It means that if one travelled back in time and learned Greek from home himself, one would not do well on the university examination in 1895. That's probably true. What do you mean you've been talking to Plato? That's totally wrong. Okay, so Haunted Loaf, Memoirs of the 20th Century, is an early work of speculative fiction by Irish writer Samuel Madden. This 1733 epistolary novel takes the form of a series of diplomatic letters written in 1997 and 1998. Wow. And the book is notable as an early work to feature time travel. So H.G. Wells had pulled upon other... Maybe he'd come across some of these things. It's the very young man, Bill or Ted. So it's interesting to see how the concept of time travel was being mucked about with in the 17th century. In fact, that's much earlier, isn't it? I wonder if H.G. Wells came across those. He's the first person to sort of use the literary device of a time machine, though. So that's where this jumps into science fiction rather than being kind of just like an idea. Okay, so a little go, says Alan, is a preliminary examination before taking a degree. Okay, so basically what they're saying here, they're basically saying you won't pass your exams. At least you won't pass the German scholars' exams. Interesting. Okay, so a little in-joke there about the time. And then there is the future, said the very young man. Just think, one might invest all one's money and leave it to accumulate interest and hurry on ahead. So, okay, the time machine has barely even been discussed. And the very young man's already, how much money can I make out of this thing? So I just think that's brilliant. That is quite an interesting observation. Travel through time. Yes. So from the moment we become even aware of the conceptual existence of a time machine, how long is it before the question is, can we make some money out of it? Like 8 lines. Which is probably not all that far from the mark, is it? Youth those days. Maybe the young man is Marty McFly looking for a sports almanac. Yeah. Now, this is interesting here. Look, so to discover a society, said I. So actually, the narrator of this story is in the room as well. He's not just being the narrator. He's actually there. Okay, and this is the first time we understand that he's in the room. Okay, so he's actually not narrating this third hand. He's actually there, which is weird. To discover a society, said I, erected on a strictly communistic basis. Now that is an interesting political thing to chuck into the story at this point in time. Where is that come from? Now I did look up H.G. Wells' political views, and he was a strong socialist, quite liberal in his thinking, so whether he chucked that in as, well, maybe the future is not going to be what you think it is, everybody. I thought that was quite an interesting thing to chuck in at that point. Of all the wild, extravagant theories began this, I go, well, that will never happen. Yes, so it seemed to me, and so I never talked about it until, we don't know who that was. Assume that's the time traveller. Experimental verification, cried I. You are going to verify that? I.e., presumably the future. The experiment, cried Philby, who was now getting brain weary. I think we're all getting brain weary, actually, Philby. I think we're all with you there. Let's see your experiment anyhow, said the psychologist, though it's all humbug, you know. Humbug. The time traveller smiled round at us. I don't know. How do you smile around at people? Is that something you put a smile on your face like this, and you sort of beam it? You sort of beam your smile. I don't know how you smile around at people. Using the same word in close proximity. See, a good editor would have picked that up straight away. The time traveller smiled round at us, then still smiling faintly with his hands deep in his trouser pockets. His trousers pockets. Though we wouldn't say that nowadays. We'd say trouser pockets. Well, maybe that's not correct. Trousers pockets. He walked slowly out of the room. Another adverb. Bad boy. And we heard his slippers shuffling down the long passage to his laboratory. The psychologist looked at us. I wonder what he's got. Some sleight of hand trick or another, said the medical man. And Philby tried to tell us about a conjurer he'd seen at Burnslem. But before he'd finished his preface, the time traveller came back, and Philby's anecdote collapsed. Bum, bum, bum. Okay, so there we go. That's the first chapter, which was quite a lot to wade through. But what we basically have is a nice sort of I suppose it's Victorian, isn't it? Victorian. Put on a singular trouser. No, I know. Totally trousered. So there's an inkling there that this is there's a little bit of political stuff coming up, which in fact there is. So that's quite interesting. And we'll get to that. But it's not that well written. This it's some great. It's one of those things. If somebody had given me this now, as somebody who's written quite a lot of novels, I would say that's a great idea, Mr. Wells. Really like what you've done with this. You've piqued my interest, but you need to go away, right? Bring those characters in. Give us a bit more scene setting. Don't jump straight into that dialogue. So here's me critiquing the masters of science fiction and saying his first book wasn't really all again. And if you were coming to those concepts for the first time, I mean, I see what H.G. Wells is trying to do there. He's trying to introduce the idea of a fourth dimension, presumably to an audience who's never come across that concept before. Now, that's quite a hard sell to do in one chapter. Introduce 6 or 7 characters and have it all stand up. And so, fair play to him. He's bitten off quite a lot there to try and achieve, isn't he? So it could have been done better, but it's a big ask there. So there we go. Where's the lower half of a bikini called bikini bottoms? I don't know. What kind of question is that? I feel sorry for the readers facing the concept of time. Yeah, Frank, you're quite on point with that. That's a very, very good observation. Right, at the time H.G. Wells had written this book, Commander Data's head was already lying in the San Francisco subterranean basement. Thanks, Glenn. Right, so the machine. Okay, so there's going to be a machine. Okay, so right now, so the time traveller comes back. And this is quite interesting because this is how the machine, and this isn't the machine, this is a machine, is described. So the thing the time traveller held in his hand was a glittering metallic framework. So that's quite an interesting description. Scarcely larger than a small clock and very delicately made. I think the presence of the narrator in the room is implied at the start. Is it? Maybe I missed that. So the time traveller, his pale grey eyes, one of our chairs being his patents. So I suppose it is sort of. It's not very clear though, is it, that there's the narrator there? But he is talking to us, which includes a person, I suppose. Yeah, okay, I'll give you that. I'll give you that one, Alan. I'll give you that one. But it's not. I don't think that was very clear. And it's odd that the narrator waits until virtually the end of the chapter before he says anything. But anyway, there we go. Right, so the thing the time traveller held in his hand was a glittering metallic framework scarcely larger than a small clock and very delicately made. There was ivory in it and some transparent crystalline substance. And now I must be explicit, for this that follows, unless his explanation is to be accepted, is an absolutely unaccountable thing. Okay, so basically what this is quite a nice little thing Um, yeah, so the narrator is now calling the time traveller the time traveller. So basically, the narrator here is basically saying, well, unless this story is true, I have no explanation for what happens next, which is quite nice. I thought that was quite good. He took one of the small octagonal tables which were scattered about the room. Okay, so octagonal tables, I've got one of those. They're fairly common of the time. But basically, it's just a table that's octagonalized. It's squared off twice, if that makes sense. Set it in front of the fire with 2 legs on the hearthrug. On this table, he placed the mechanism. He drew up a chair and sat down. And the only other object on the table was a small shaded lamp, the bright light of which fell upon the model. Okay, so there's a table, there's a thing, the time machine-y thing, okay, and then there's a light, right? There are also a dozen candles about, 2 in brass candlesticks upon the mantel, and several sconces. I used to know what a sconce was. I can't remember what a sconce is. A sconce is, it's like a thing to hang. It hangs a light off the wall. Okay, there we go. Old-fashioned word. So the room was brightly illuminated. Okay, so you can see what's going on. I sat in the low armchair nearest the fire, and I drew this forward so as to be almost between the time traveller and the fireplace. Philby sat behind him, looking over his shoulder. So they're all basically looking very closely at what's going on. The medical man and the provincial mayor watched him in profile from the right, and the psychologist from the left. The very young man, all in capitals now, stood behind the psychologist. We were all on the alert. It appears incredible to me that any kind of trick, however subtly conceived and however adroitly done — adroitly is a good word, isn't it? — could have been played upon us under these conditions. So basically, you set the scene. We're all clustered around the time traveller. He's got his device, and we're waiting to see what happens, which is a nice little bit of tension building up there. So, well, says the psychologist, prompting the next chapter. So that's quite good. That's quite good. This little affair, said the time traveller, resting his elbows upon the table and pressing his hands together above their apparatus, is only a model. Just knocked it up, as you do. It's my plan for a machine to travel through time. You will notice that it looks singularly askew, i.e. kind of tilted or not quite right. And there is an odd twinkling appearance about this bar, as though it was in some way unreal. Okay, so I'm presuming he's referring to the transparent crystalline substance. We don't get much more in the way of description, so we have to use our imaginations here. Pardon the crudity of this model, I didn't have time to paint it. That's right, exactly. So you do wonder if the people who wrote Back to the Future did have a little leaf through here for some homages. He pointed to the part with his finger, and also here is one a little white lever, and here is another. So there's 2 levers on this device. The medical man got up off his chair and peered into the thing. It is beautifully made, he said. Okay, so it's quite a nice object, whatever this thing is. Took 2 years, retorted the time traveller. And when we'd all imitated the action of the medical man, so they've all had a good nosy at the device. He said, now I want you to understand that this lever being pressed over sends the machine gliding into the future. And this other reverses the motion. Okay. This saddle, which again, bit of bad writing here. He's not described the object sufficiently for us to understand where the saddle is. The saddle represents the seat of a time traveller, so I'm assuming that the box has got some sort of model seat in it. Presently, I'm going to press the lever, and off the machine will go. It'll vanish and pass into the future time and disappear. Have a good look at the thing, and look at the table too, and satisfy yourself there is no trickery. I don't want to waste this model and be told I'm a quack. Okay, so quack is a false doctor. Okay. A practitioner who doesn't know his stuff, basically. Now, I think this one's rather curious. Is okay, you've got a model. How does he know this thing works? Right? Because it's got 2 levers. It reminds me of the Holly Hop drive from Red Dwarf. It's got, okay, so this is the on button. Yeah, right. You could probably figure out the rest of the controls for yourself. This time model has a forward button and a back button, or a forward lever and a back lever. Better a quack than the ducky. Exactly. it seems odd to me that the time traveller, being in a position where he spent 2 years designing a time machine that actually works, at least one presumes it actually works, why he didn't invent some sort of clockwork mechanism, which wouldn't have been beyond the bounds of his capability, one would have thought, to sort of reverse the process so that the thing, he wouldn't waste his model every time. I mean, imagine spending 2 years working on something. You press a lever on it and it disappears. What's he trying to demonstrate? So that feels a bit curious to me. Anyway, so there was a minute's pause while everybody clustered around the table thought about this. Why bother with 2 levers if he thought he was exactly? It doesn't quite make sense, does it? The psychologist seemed to speak to me, but was about to speak to me, but changed his mind. And then the time traveller put forth his fingers towards the lever. "No," he said suddenly, "lend me your hand. This could be really, really dangerous. I don't want to lose my fingers." So it was the psychologist himself who sent forth the time machine on this interminable voyage. We all saw the lever turn, and I'm absolutely certain there was no trickery. Now this bit's quite good. Now there's a breath of wind and the lamp flame jumped. Okay, one of the candles on the mantle was blown out, and the machine suddenly swung around, became indistinct, was seen for a ghost for a second, perhaps as a faint entity of glittering brass and ivory, and then it was gone, vanished, save for the lamp. The table was bare. Now, I quite like the fact that there was a little breath of wind here, and the lamp flame jump, because it kind of, if you think about it, if an object jumps into the future from the present moment, it's probably going to leave a vacuum, isn't it? So there should be a sort of a pop of air, perhaps, maybe even a little clap of thunder, as the thing disappears. But I like the fact that the flames jump. There's quite a nice literary little flourish there, isn't it? You know, stuff happens when the machine goes off. So could he send it to a future a minute ahead? Well, oddly enough, my recollection of this story was that that's what he did, and I was quite surprised when I read this to find that that's not what happens. So it's funny, your memory gets clouded by all the other stuff that you watched. I mean, obviously he should have put a dog in it and sent it forward a minute into the future, because that's not unethical at all, is it? I think the problem is that it doesn't jump through time. It doesn't. It traverses it faster. Yes, so you'll never catch up with it unless it gets put into reverse later. So I think I would have invented some sort of clockwork mechanism that activated the levers and switched them back, so that it could go forward a bit, reverse a bit, and then stop. So you could set it, go forward faster, then come backwards, and it would always return to the present moment after a delay of a few minutes or whatever it was you do. So, can't have been beyond the wit of the time traveller. Thank heavens I never invented one, poor Lizzie. In the film, he used a cigar in the model. So there are multiple films of this as well. We ought to discuss the film. Drew would have been a better time traveller. Yeah, pocket watch, exactly, a pocket watch. Why isn't there a watch in the machine? That would have been quite good. So none of this is beyond the art of the 19th century. He could have put a pocket watch in the machine, and made it disappear and come back, and it would still be showing it should still be showing the same time. But anyway, he didn't. Right, so it's gone, right? This little model has disappeared in front of their eyes. Everyone was silent for a minute. I quite like this. And then Philby said he was damned. He doesn't do this in dialogue, which is an interesting choice. But I'm damned is what Philby's actually said. But he doesn't say it in dialogue, which is an interesting choice. The psychologist recovered from his stupor and suddenly looked under the table. And the time traveller laughed cheerfully. "Well," he said, with a reminiscence of the psychologist. And then getting up, he went to the tobacco jar on the mantel, and with his back to us, began to fill his pipe. So he's just going to go and have a smoke while the rest of us figure out what the hell has just happened. "Now look here," said the medical man. "Are you in earnest about this? Do you seriously believe that machine has travelled into time?" "Certainly," said the time traveller, stooping to light a spill at the fire. And a spill, I presume, is his pipe. Then he turned, lighting his pipe. Oh no, maybe not. What's a spill? Does anyone know what a spill is? Not sure about that one either. Anyway, he lights his pipe. Maybe it's like a taper or something. And he looked at the psychologist's face. The psychologist, to show he was not unhinged, helped himself to a cigar and tried to light it uncut. So clearly he was unhinged. What is more, I have a big machine nearly finished in there. He points at the laboratory. And when that is put together, I mean to have a journey on my own account. So there's a bigger time machine that you can actually ride. You mean to say the machine has travelled into the future, said Philby, slowly catching up with the previous paragraph. Into the future or the past? And this is an interesting thing. Okay, so into the future or the past, I don't for certain know which. So he doesn't actually know which way it went, which doesn't really make sense, because if it had gone, actually, we'll come across this. After an interval, the psychologist had an inspiration. It must have gone into the past if it's gone anywhere, he said. Why? Said the time traveller. Because I presume that it's not moved in space, and if it travelled into the future, it would still be here all this time, since it must have travelled through this time. Quite interesting observation. But, said I, the narrator steps into the thing, if it had travelled into the past, it would have been visible when we first came into this room. So this isn't quite causality, but it's not far off it, is it? If it travelled into the past, it would have been visible when we first came into this room, and last Thursday when we were here, and the Thursday before that, and so on forth. So they've obviously been meeting regularly for a while, these guys. Serious objections, remarked the provincial mayor with an air of impartiality, turning towards the time traveller. Answer that one. Not a bit, said the time traveller, and then to the psychologist, you think you can explain that, but it's presentation below the threshold, you know, diluted presentation. Which apparently is a psychological thing, okay? Of course, said the psychologist, reassured. That's a simple point of psychology. I should have thought of it. It's plain enough and helps the paradox delightfully. We cannot see it, nor can we appreciate this machine any more than we can the spoke of a wheel spinning or a bullet flying through the air. If it's travelling through time 50 times or 100 times faster than we are, if it gets through a minute while we get through a second, the impression it creates will of course only be 1/50th or 100th of what it would make if it were not travelling in time. That's plain enough. So we can't see it because it's travelling through time at the time. Okay. So the time travel model will reach the end of our current universe before the universe does. So I'm not quite... Yeah, there are a few anomalies about that, because if it's travelling through time quickly, is it there or is it not there? It's an interesting one. So H.G. Wells, this is where the time machine differs from other time machines we're familiar. Will there be a restaurant? Hopefully, yes. Because all the time machines that came after jump from specific dates to specific dates. Okay, so okay, so Back to the Future, back to 1955, right? Or back forward to 2015, or well, back to 2015 as it is now. Okay, or the TARDIS from Doctor Who jumps to specific points in time. Okay, time and relative dimensions in space. Whereas this time machine, you actually travel through time. Okay, and if you want to land at a specific date, you have to sort of accelerate and then decelerate and hope that you end up at the right point. So it's not a very precise time machine, but it doesn't just jump there. You have to sort of go through all the periods between wherever you are and where you want to be, as if you were kind of playing a cassette tape of it. You have to fast forward and reverse. You can't just jump to it like a CD. Okay, so you've got to fast forward. So it's interesting. Okay, so that's a different type of time machine to what we're possibly kind of used to. The reason for that is folks are now sick of time-lapse movies. Yeah, it's like it enters a wormhole. Otherwise, it would still be there in the times it moved forward to. So yes, it is sort of still there, but they're not. H.G. Wells's explanation of it is we can't perceive it because it's not here enough in this particular moment because it's already gone through it. So whether that makes sense, I'm not entirely sure, but it's quite it sort of makes sense as a concept, but it's not quite the same sort of time travel as we're used to. So we sat and stared at the vacant table for a minute or so, and then the time traveller asked what we thought of it all. It sounds plausible enough tonight, said the medical man. But wait until tomorrow. Wait for the common sense of the morning. So yes, obviously everything makes no sense at all in the middle of the night. Would you like to see the time machine itself? Asked the time traveller. And therewith, we should use the word therewith more often. Taking the lamp in his hand, he led the way down the long drafty corridor to his laboratory. I remember vividly the flickering light, his queer broad head in the silhouette, the dance of the shadows, and how we all followed him, puzzled but incredulous, and how they were in the laboratory we beheld a larger edition of the little mechanism which we had seen vanish before our eyes. Parts are of nickel, parts of ivory, parts have been filed or sawn out of rock crystal. The thing was generally complete, but the twisted crystalline bars lay unfinished upon the bench, beside some sheets of drawings, and I took one up for a better look. It appeared to be quartz. Okay, so it's interesting. It's quartz. Now look here, said the medical man. Are you perfectly serious, or is this a trick, like that ghost you showed us last Christmas? No context for the ghost last Christmas, but presumably it was some sort of optical illusion. Upon that machine, said the time traveller, holding the lamp aloft, I intend to explore time. Bum, bum, bum. Is that plain? I was never more serious in my life. Despite the fact I'm not sure whether this time machine goes forwards or backwards when it operates. I caught Philby's eye over the shoulder of the medical man. Sounds very awkward, doesn't it? Would you like your eye back, sir? He winked at me solemnly. I presume it wasn't actually catching his eye, but there we are. I think chapter 2 gets a bit more done than chapter 1 in some ways. It kind of moves us forward. Okay, there's a time machine, and it's moved forward or backward. We don't know which in time, and has disappeared. So time travel is a thing. Who could have guessed it? Now, and so this is where the story is rather interesting, because we actually never voyage with the time traveller. Okay, we don't voyage with the time traveller. What happens here is he appears. So let's get into that one. I think that at the time none of us quite believed in the time machine. I mean, it's an odd thing to say, isn't it? Because I mean, okay, so it's a pretty impressive trick. Okay, making a box disappear on the table, but it's not necessarily out of the, is time travel the simplest explanation for a disappearing box? Probably not. But the fact is, the time traveller is one of those men who are clever, too clever to be believed. Okay, I've been called too clever myself. And you never felt you saw all around him. You always suspected some subtle reserve, some ingenuity and ambush behind his lucid frankness. He likes his adjectives, does H.G. Wells at this point. Had Philby shown the model and explained the matter in the time traveller's words, we should have shown him far less scepticism. For we would have perceived his motives a pork butcher could understand Philby. Okay, so Philby's your average chap. Okay, if Philby can understand it, we can all understand it. But the time traveller had more than a touch of whim among his elements, and we distrusted him. Things that would have made the fame of less clever man seemed tricks in his hands. It's a mistake to do things too easily. The serious people who took him seriously, there's another error, never quite felt sure of his deportment. They were somehow aware that trusting their reputations for judgment with him was like furnishing a nursery with an eggshell china. It's like, hey, Mr. Wells, get to the point. So I don't think any of us said very much about travelling in the interval between that Thursday and the next. Okay, so a week has gone past. So they've seen the time traveller make a box disappear, and then they've wandered off and done whatever they do for the in Victorian England for a week. And we didn't think much about it. Totally unremarkable. What did you do last Thursday? Well, a time traveller said he made a time machine that disappeared in front of us, for which we have no explanation, but nothing other than that, nothing out of the ordinary at all. Okay. Though its odd potentialities ran no doubt in most of our minds. Okay, so they did think about it a bit. This is one of those. It's just paragraph goes on for. Look at the length of that paragraph. That's just bad. Okay, Mr. Wells, cut that paragraph up into bits. For my own part, I was particularly preoccupied with the trick of the model. I remember discussing with the medical man who I met on Friday at the Linnaean, which is sort of a gentleman's club. He said he'd seen a similar thing done at Tübingen. Tübingen? I've no idea how you pronounce that. And laid considerable stress on the blowing out of the candle. but how the trick was done he could not explain. So they think it's a trick. Okay, they're rationalising it as a trick, which is fair enough. So the next Thursday I went again to Richmond. I suppose I was one of the time traveller's most constant guests. Okay, so they all come back now. Richmond is, of course, nowadays in the centre of London, pretty much. Here it is there. But back then, this wasn't nearly as built up. So this would have been on the outskirts of town. So a reasonable horse and carriage ride down to Richmond, and it would have been a nice countrified area back then, because this is totally assimilated by London now. So that just puts that in a bit of context. Again, it's all happening in the same place. So Richmond here is just up the road from Byfleet and Woking. Okay, so H.G. Wells was really trying to put this part of the UK on the map, which I think is quite funny. So there we go. And the medical man was there again. So they're all back. Okay, they've assembled in the drawing room, and they're looking around for the time traveller. It's 7:30 now. I suppose we'd better have dinner. Where's ... or dash rather, I said, naming our host. So despite the fact that he does have a name, the narrator has scratched his name out. I think that's quite funny. Oh, you've just come. It's rather odd. He's unavoidably detained. Asks me in his note to lead off with dinner at 7 if he's not back. Says he'll explain when he comes. Now this doesn't really make a lot of sense for a time machine, is it? Because clearly what's happened here is the time traveller has gone in the time machine, right? And he's gone off on some adventures, okay, and he's coming back. And he's left instructions. So say if I'm not here at 7:30, then have dinner. Okay, not here by 7, have dinner. But we've got a time machine. So surely if he's coming back, then he can just sort of slowly reverse up to time. He'll see all his guests having dinner and go, oh, damn, I've missed it. So he can go back in time a bit further until they haven't had dinner before they've even walked in the room. Stop the time machine there, go, hello everybody, I'm back. So that doesn't really make a lot of sense, that the time traveller is going to be late for his appointment. So you should be able to be pretty damned precise, I would have thought. Anyway, there's another character here joining us. Well, it seems a pity to let the dinner spoil. Very practical whoever this person is. Said the editor of a well-known daily paper. Okay, we don't know who he was, or we don't know what the paper was, but he's well known. And thereopon the doctor rang the bell. Now I don't know who the doctor is. I'm assuming the doctor is the medical man. So it's slightly confusing. Okay, we've swapped from being the medical man to the doctor now. That's right. Hello, I'm back. Let's have the dinner you already had. Maybe there's only enough. I don't know. We don't know really how the time machine works. Maybe he couldn't get it right or something. Maybe it's not very precise. The psychologist was the only person besides the doctor and myself who had attended the previous dinner. Okay, so I'm assuming the doctor is the medical man. The other men were blank. The other men were blank. I don't know what that means. The editor aforementioned, a certain journalist, and another, a quiet, shy man with a beard, whom I didn't know. And so why is he introducing more characters at this point? It's odd. And who, as far as my observation went, never opened his mouth all evening. So there's a quiet, shy man with a beard who doesn't do anything. So why is he there? So I think it's most peculiar. There was some speculation at the dinner table about the time traveller's absence, and I suggested time travelling in a half jocular spirit. Oh, well, that's a good joke. The editor wanted that explained to him, and the psychologist volunteered a wooden account of the ingenious paradox and trick we had witnessed a week before. And was in the midst of the exposition when the door from the corridor opened, and slowly without noise. I was facing the door and first saw it. "Hello," I said, "at last. and the door opened wide, and the time traveller stood before us. He's returned. He's come back from wherever he was. I gave a cry of surprise. Good heavens, man, what's the matter? Cried the medical man, who's now the medical man again and not the doctor. Maybe it was just Doctor Who. Is the doctor. And the whole table turned towards the door. And so we're introduced to the time traveller once again. And he was in an amazing plight. Okay, so in a bad way. His coat was dusty and dirty and smeared with green down the sleeves. His hair disordered, and it seemed to me greyer, either with dust or dirt, because its colour had actually faded. His face was ghastly pale. His chin had a brown cut on it, a cut half healed, so some time has transpired. His expression was haggard and drawn, as by intense suffering, and for a moment he hesitated in the doorway as if he had been dazzled by the light. He came into the room. He walked with just such a limp as I have seen in footsore tramps, and we stared at him in silence, expecting him to speak. So clearly something's up. He said not a word, but came painfully to the table and made a motion towards the wine. What on earth have you been up to, man? Said the doctor, or the medical man, or the doctor, we're not sure. The time traveller did not seem to hear. Don't let me disturb you, he said, with a certain faltering articulation. A gasp, I think we'd call it nowadays. I'm all right. And he stopped, held out a glass of more, and took off a draught. That's good, he said. Save me some of that mutton. I'm starving for a bit of meat. So he's come back from his travails, the time traveller, and clearly a little bit worse for the wear. And then he basically goes back out again, and he has nothing on his feet but a pair of tattered, blood-stained socks. And he's wandered off. For a minute, perhaps, my mind was wool gathering, which presumes that nobody knows what to do. And then, remarkable behaviour of an eminent scientist, I heard the editor say. He's obviously thinking up headlines, which is quite good. What's the game, said the journalist. Has he been doing the amateur cadger? No idea what that is. I don't follow. I met the other psychologist and read my own interpretation in his face. So those two have seen this before. They hang on a bit. I thought the time traveller limping painfully upstairs. I don't think anyone else had noticed his lameness, other than the description kind of points to the fact that it was very, very noticeable. So it takes them a long. There's very little concern for the time traveller here. I mean, he's just wandered in with bloods, in a state of complete disarray, grabbed some champagne, staggered back out again with bloody socks, and everybody's kind of like, I'm sure he'll be fine. So they try and explain it there, and then basically, I say, said the editor, these chaps here say you've been travelling to the middle of next week. Tell us about it, will you? What do you take for it? Anyway, so he's back. The time traveller comes down, eats some food, and it takes a while to get to the cut to the chase here. The medical man is back, not being a doctor. The silent man seemed even more clumsy than usual. Drank champagne with regularity and determination out of sheer nervousness. There's nothing else but be silent. And then at last, the time traveller pushed his plate away and looked around. I suppose I must apologise, he said. I was simply starving. I've had the most amazing time. He reached out his hand for a cigar, cut the end, but come into the smoking room. It's too long a story to tell over greasy plates. Okay, so to the smoking room, everyone. Quick, let's go. Have you told Blank and Dash and Chose about the machine? I don't know who they are. Oh, there we go. Leaning back in his chair and naming the three guests. Who's called Blank? I can't argue tonight, but I don't mind telling you the story. I'll tell you the story of what has happened to me if you like, but you must refrain from interruptions. I want to tell it badly. Okay. Could you not tell us it well, Mr. Wells? I don't want to tell us it badly. Tell us it really good. Most of you will sound like lying. So be it. It's true, every word, all the same. I was in my laboratory at 4 o'clock, and since I've lived 8 days. Such days as no human being has ever lived before. I'm nearly worn out, but I shan't sleep until I've told this thing to you. Then I shall go to bed. But no interruptions. Is it agreed? It's agreed. Bum, bum, bum. Okay, so... right, okay, so then we get a bit of description about what it's like to time travel. Now we get into some good stuff here. I told you last Thursday about the principles of the time machine. Okay, it's a little travel worn now, busted, something's bent, etc., etc., etc. So some stuff happened. Okay. It was at 10 o'clock today that the first of all time machines began its career. I gave it a last tap, tried all the screws again, put one more drop of oil on the quartz rod, highly sophisticated machine, and sat myself in the saddle. I suppose a suicide who holds a pistol to his skull feels much the same wonder at what will come next as I felt then. There should have been a little bit more testing going on before you jump into this thing, but there we go. I took the starting lever in one hand and the stopping one in the other. Okay, so there's a start lever and a stop lever. I pressed the first and almost immediately the second. I seemed to reel. I felt a nightmare sensation of falling, and looking around I saw the laboratory exactly as before. Had anything happened? For a moment I suspected my intellect had tricked me, and then I noted the clock. A moment before it seemed it had stood a minute or so past 10, and now it was nearly 3:30. So you travelled 5.5 hours into the future. Bum bum bum. I drew a breath and set my teeth, gripping the starting lever with both hands, and went off with a thud. The laboratory. Okay, so the description of time travelling here is quite interesting. The laboratory got hazy and went dark. Mrs. Watchett came in and walked, she's presumably the housekeeper, apparently without seeing me, towards the garden door. I suppose it took her a minute or so to traverse this place, but to me she seemed to shoot across the room like a rocket. I pressed the lever over to its extreme position, so maximum fast forward mode. Night came like the turning out of a lamp, and in another moment came tomorrow. Okay, so he's moving forward about a day a second when it's at full whack. The laboratory grew faint and hazy, and then fainter and ever fainter. Tomorrow night came black, and then day again, night again, day again, faster and still. An eddying murmur filled my ears. A strange, dumb confusedness descended upon my mind. I'm afraid I cannot convey the peculiar sensations of time travelling. They are excessively unpleasant. There is a feeling exactly like one has on a switchback. So a switchback is an old-fashioned word for a roller coaster, except they wouldn't have had upside-down roller coasters then. They would have had what they called scenic railways. Of helpless headlong motion. I felt the same horrible anticipation too of an imminent smash. So it's like you're falling off a precipice. No de-throttle, no indeed. Stop it. As I put on pace, night followed day like the flapping of a black wing. So you've got this sort of almost stroboscopic black day, dark day, like that going on. The dim suggestion of laboratory seemed presently to fall away from me, and I saw the sun hopping swiftly across the sky, leaping at every minute, and every minute marking a day. I suppose the laboratory had been destroyed and I'd come into the open air. So it's interesting. So he's moved forward in time enough that the laboratory where his house is has been knocked down. I had a dim impression of scaffolding, so that's quite cool. So there's been storm damage or something. But I was already going too fast to be conscious of any moving things. Okay, so he seems to be accelerating forward through time. The speed at which he's travelling is getting faster and faster. The snowiest snail that ever crawled dashed by too fast for me. Okay, so he's going so fast you can't even see snails move now. The twinkling succession of darkness and light was excessively painful to the eye. You can imagine that dark, that would be stroboscopic, kind of very unpleasant. Then in the intermittent darkness I saw the moon spinning swiftly through her quarters from new to full, and had a faint glimpse of the circling stars. Presently, as I went on, still gaining velocity, okay, so he's still accelerating, the palpitation of night and day merged into one continuous greyness. Okay, so he's really moving forward so fast he can't tell the difference between night and day. So it's interesting, at full power the time machine doesn't go off at a constant speed through time. It starts off relatively slow and then accelerates. The sky took on a wonderful deepness of blue, a splendid luminous colour like that of early twilight, and the jerking sun became a streak of fire, a brilliant arch in space, the moon a fainter fluctuating band, and I could see nothing of the stars save now and then a brighter circle flickering in the blue. So this is Wells at his best. Okay, this is good description, because it's sort of what would happen. He's imagined what would the passage of time look like if you could speed it up. And this is before the days of any kind of film type the ability to film these things and speed them up. It's so it's quite a piece of imagination here. So this is H.G. Wells being good at what he's doing. The landscape was misty and vague. I was still on the hillside at which this house now stands, and the shoulder rose above me, grey and dim. I saw trees growing and changing like puffs of vapour. So he's really kicking forward now at high speed. His house has disappeared, and forests are growing up on the house on the hill where his house was. So what's happened to London? Because this is in Richmond, obviously. Now, if he'd gone through time that we know, because of course H.G. Wells is writing 1895, he doesn't know what the future is going to be, so he can't. But he'd seen massive amounts of housing being built around him. When these were put into the films, this particular bit was done well. You're quite right, Cedar. The 1960 movie did this well too. So they spent a lot of time on this bit because this is quite a cool piece of the story, the actual travelling through time. He goes through in the 1960s film. Correct me if I'm wrong, but he ends up, of course, in the second. I think either the First World War or the Second World. It's probably the Second World War. And of course, he slows down to have a look at what's going on because he sees all this destruction. And because the film was done in the 1960s, they obviously knew about this First World War, so they basically got the time traveller to in absolute horror, perceive flying machines dropping bombs on London. So that's it was quite an interesting thing. And even in the later one, the modern one, which wasn't great, but it was a bit of fun. The CGI of time passing, in this thing is a nice moment in those films. Now, the question of what if a tree was right where his machine sat, is an interesting one. Okay, but H.G. Wells does consider that, I think. The landscape was misty and vague. I was still on the hillside upon which this house now stands, and the shoulder rose above me, grey and dim. I saw huge buildings rise up, faint and fair, and passed like dreams. So civilization did grow up around him. The whole surface of the earth seemed changed, melting and flowing under my eyes. So he's now going so fast that he's actually witnessing geological time. The little hands upon the dials that registered my speed. So he does have some instrumentation. That's the first time that's been mentioned. Raced around faster and faster. Presently I noted the sun belt swayed up. Now this is a really clever little touch. Presently I noticed the sun's belt swayed up and down from solstice to solstice in a minute or less. So that basically says a year is going past every minute. And that consequently my pace was every year a minute. Okay, there we go. A minute by minute, the white snow flashed across the world and vanished, and was followed by the bright green of spring. So that's a nice touch, because that's, if you could speed up that's exactly what you would see. The sun moving up and down as the the Earth's axial tilt round comes into effect as we orbit the sun. The unpleasant sensations of the start were less poignant now. They emerged into a sort of hysterical exhilaration. I remarked, indeed, a clumsy swaying of the machine, for which I was unable to account. But my mind was too confused to attend it, so with a sort of madness growing upon me, I flung myself into futurity. So you just charged into the future with complete wild abandon, as you would on your first recce in the time machine. The details are sparse here, which I think is probably the right thing, because there was no way H.G. Wells would know what was coming. But presently a fresh series of impressions grew upon my mind, certain curiosity and a certain dread, until at last they took complete possession of me. What strange developments of humanity, what wonderful advances upon our civilization, I thought, might not appear when I came back to look early into the dim elusive world that raced and fluctuated before my eyes. Who knows what's out there, what happens in the future? I saw a great and splendid architecture rising about me, more massive than any buildings of our time. Makes sense. And yet it seemed built of glimmer and mist. I saw a richer green flow up the hillside and remain there without any wintry intermission. He's accurately predicted global warming in 1895. Even through the veil of my confusion, the earth seemed very fair, and so my mind came round to the business of stopping. Now, here's the point. Here's the point about what if a tree was right where his machine sat. So H.G. Wells has thought about this. The peculiar risk lay in the possibility of my finding some substance in the space which I or the machine occupied. So long as I travelled at high velocity through time, this scarcely mattered. I was, so to speak, attenuated, and was slipping like a vapour through the interstices of intervening substances. I don't know whether it's possible to slip through the interstices of intervening substances, but clearly it is for the purposes of this story. But to come to a stop involved jamming myself, molecule by molecule, into whatever lay in my way, meant bringing my atoms into such intimate contact with those of the obstacle that a profound chemical reaction, in fact, Mr. Wells, a profound nuclear reaction is likely to be the result of that, possibly a far-reaching explosion, quite possibly, would result, and blow myself and my apparatus out of all possible dimensions into the unknown. This possibility had occurred to me again and again while I was making the machine, so he's thought about some of the health and safety concerns of operating a time machine. But then I had cheerfully accepted it as an unavoidable risk. Cheerfully. Well, quite a strong possibility of utter destruction and a totally earth-shattering explosion, but hey-ho, off we go. It's one of the risks a man has got to take. It kind of, and I think that is genuinely a bit of, that was the air of the time. Okay, what ho, chalks away. Let's just send it. Basically, is the attitude there. Could it go badly wrong? Yes, it could be an absolute massive explosion. Oh well, best of luck, old chap. Now the risk was inevitable. I no longer saw it in the same cheerful light. Well, at least he's had a dose of realism there as he's deciding to do it. The fact is that insensibly the absolute strangeness of everything, the sickly jarring and swaying of the machine, above all the feeling of prolonged falling, had absolutely upset my nerves, which I can understand. I told myself that I could never stop, and with a gust of petulance I resolved to stop forthwith. Like an impatient fool, I tugged over the lever, and incontinently the thing went reeling over, and I was flung headlong through the air. Okay, so he's basically slammed on the brakes of the time machine, and for some strange reason that chucks him out and flings him through the air. There was a sound of a clap of thunder in my ears. I may have been stunned for a moment. A pitiless hail was hissing down around me, and I was sitting on soft turf in front of the overset machine. Everything seemed grey, but presently I remarked that the confusion in my ears was gone. I looked around me, and I was on what appeared to be a little lawn in the garden, surrounded by rhododendron bushes. Very nice. I like rhododendrons. I noticed that their mauve and purple blossoms were dropping in the shower under the beating of the hailstones. The rebounding, dancing hail hung in a little cloud over the machine and drove along the ground like smoke, and in a moment I was wet to the skin. "Fine hospitality," I said, "to a man who's travelled innumerable years to see you." And at this point, it's kind of where the actual adventure starts, okay, and it's probably a good point to stop reading and just muse over the some of the themes that come out later into this, because obviously spoilers ahead. This is a book that's over 100 years old, so you've had your time, you've had your chance to catch up with it, but we finally got into the far distant future, okay. And as you know, Mr. Wells was an author who liked to comment on the issues of the day. All right. Now, you don't have to read this story in that light. You can just read it as an educational story. But essentially, what happens is he encounters two types of being from this point forward. And so, spoiler, yeah, he does get home, as we know, because he's already done that. But he encounters two types of descendants of mankind, effectively, or humankind, should we say nowadays. And they're called the Eloi and the Morlocks. And what he essentially says is that there's a facet of humanity that stays above ground, and is effectively the descendants of rich people on the earth. Okay, so the well-to-do. But what happens to them is, whilst they're all lovely and they're pretty and they're nice, they lose all sense of curiosity about everything. They don't care. They lose their intellectual verve. They have no knowledge. They have no curiosity anymore. They lose their everything is just flowers and pretty plants and bathing in the swimming pools kind of thing. And then the flip side is the Morlocks, kind of evil things, right? Who go around basically every so often kidnapping the Eloi. And they're a bit more industrial, they're a bit more intelligent, arguably. They're sort of descended from the lower classes of Victorian society, and and they live underground, and they do industrial things underground, and so it's basically a bit of a political thing about exactly that Wintermute, the bourgeois and the proletariat. Morlocks are evil. Well, they do go around and do some pretty dreadful things. And it's basically a story. It's what happens to him from here on out is that he encounters both sides, and he's effectively dissatisfied and quite disillusioned with what happens to humanity. We ultimately don't progress any further with our intellect, and he comes back a bit of a broken man. The poor will eat the rich, which comes to shove. So it becomes a bit of a political story there, but it's worth a read. It's worth a read, I think. Michael Morlock, he's okay. Yes, so he doesn't get the girl either, so I don't think the girl gets got in many of H.G. Wells's stories, actually. Worth a read. And I think the observation to take a back away from from this sort of brief foray through the time machine is it's some really good ideas here, and this is an early Wells novel, so you can see he had the scientific background to write really, really good stories, and he had some really good ideas, and he clearly thought things through. There's a bit of humour in there. There's snatches of good dialogue, but his writing was very much in a formative phase when he wrote this book. So this is an early book, and it looks like an early book. It looks like an early draft almost of an H.G. Wells novel. So it's quite interesting to look at it from that perspective. Really, really good concepts. His description of the time travel in particular is really, really good. So he's got a really a good thing there. So again, I wouldn't give this as such a high rating as War of the Worlds. I don't think it's nearly as a complete novel. But it's worth a read. It also gives you a bit of an insight into the politics and the social preoccupations of the era as well, which is quite good. It's written well enough that it's not a chore to read most of the time. There are a few bits where it gets a bit turgid and a bit sort of lengthy, but it cracks along at a reasonable pace, and it's not very long, this one. Okay, so the Time Machine is 32,000 words, which is virtually novella territory, really. So there we go. And then choosing the name Morlocks, Wells may have been inspired by Moloch, the Canaanite god of child sacrifice, with the Eloi analogous to children. He might have been inspired by the more lax and ethnic group in the Balkans, which attracted attention from Western travellers as a perceived archetype of barbarism and backwardness. Oh, okay, there we go. So there we go. So that's a couple. So I would give it maybe sort of 6 out of 10, whereas I would have probably given War of the Worlds 8 out of 10, or possibly even higher actually. War of the Worlds maybe 8.5, because particularly even to 21st century eyes, War of the Worlds is a very, very readable story. This is less so. This is harder work. You've got to work a bit harder to get to the good stuff in this one, but there is good stuff in there. There's some good gems. There's some nice bits that are worth reading, and it is the first story which turns time travel into a device, which is a significant moment for all of us, if we like if we like science fiction. So it's a very important story in that regard. Must try harder, says Professor Drew. Gives H.G. Wells 6 out of 10. Bit harsh. Hey, we're living in the future as far as he's concerned. So Commander Sea Dweller has an idea for the next book. Okay, so go on, Sea Dweller. What have you got for us? What have we got for? Do we want another Wells? We've done a bit of Wells. Maybe we should choose another author this time. Go for it. Yes, Flatland. Now you're going to like this one, guys. I've read this one before. Flatland, yes, a satirical novel Well, I won't spoil it. Yes, that is a really good choice. So okay, yeah, let's go with that. Where is it? Gutenberg. Flatland. A Romance of Many Dimensions. There we go. By Edwin Abbott. Interesting enough. How long is this one? Let's find out. Let's just get an estimate. So it looks a little bit longer. So give it a whirl. Start off with it. You'll get you will get. There we go. Let's just see roughly how many words it is. I'm always curious to know how long these novels are. Okay, so this one's not very long either, 34,000 words. So you might be able to have a stab at it over the next week. So find Flatland on Gutenberg, and it's another short one. You could probably get it in. Put the Gutenberg in. Yes, that's a good plan. There we go. So go here, my friends. It's not very long. This is a very interesting story as well. I've read this one in the past. You'll like this one. Anyway, so that was The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. Not as good as War of the Worlds, but still a significant novel, science fiction wise. I think that was good fun. Yeah, but yeah, I'm going to give it 6 out of 10. So next week's homework, there you go. There it is in the chats. So go and have a look at that and read that one. It is a bit of a headbender in a very good way. Yes, you'll like this. If it will work very well for those of you who've been following us along with science fiction and talking about dimensions and stuff. You'll like this story if you haven't read it before. It's definitely worth a read. It's an oldie, but it's a goodie. So we'll go there next week and see how this one stacks up. But for now, it's time to bring the time machine to a close, to pull the lever, head back to the drawing room, snuff out the candles, light a pipe, stand by the fire, call the doctor over, and nod farewell to the housekeeper. Last we've missed dinner, but there's probably port and brandy on the way out. So take it easy, my friends. I will see you next week for more discussions about historical sci-fi novels, which is all good fun. Take care, my friends. Be good. Look after yourselves. Have a fantastic week ahead, and I will see you soon. And as always, right on. Take care and see you soon.